Tim Linder here. Let's talk about resolution and pixel dimension. Photoshop has, a lot of people kind of use those terms interchangeably. Photoshop, if you were to go to image size, you'll see dimensions or pixel dimensions up here, and you'll see resolution kind of separately. They designate resolution as to how many of those pixels, how many of these little squares are going to be packed into any given inch. The more pixels that you have in any given inch, the better quality it's kind of considered. And when you were to print this off, if you have 300 pixels per inch, you aren't going to necessarily going to be able to see any individual pixels, or kind of I guess you would call it that kind of angularity of those pixels. Or if you were to print them really large, you might be able to see them by the naked eye in a print. You'll be able to see all these little squares. You kind of want to probably steer away from that sort of thing when you're printing it. You never really want to be able to break it down to that individual level when you're viewing an image. As you print it, you don't want to be able to see those pixels. And if you pack 300 pixels in any given inch, you're probably going to not be able to see that. It depends on the images and those sort of things, but you could sometimes go down to as low as 150, 120 maybe even pixels per inch packed into any given inch, and you may not be able to see the naked eye or be able to tell that resolution kind of break down and get that sort of jagged pixelization effect that you might see. So when you're printing something, that's probably the goal, right? You want to print it so that you don't, or that the person viewing it doesn't see that breakdown of pixels. It just kind of all looks like one clear image to them. It doesn't zoom in to where you're able to kind of see that, right? When we're in digital, we can zoom way in and out, but if I were to double click and look at this at 100% on my screen, I'm unable to see any given pixel at 100%. I might see a little grain there in my image, but not necessarily the individual pixels, right? So another thing is, when you go to File, New, you're given an option over here to how many pixels do you want to choose, or if you choose you want inches, how many pixels per any given inch. So as I mentioned, rule of thumb, you want at least 150 pixels per inch, and preferably up to 300 pixels per inch on any given image when you're printing it, so that you don't see those individual pixels. If you have something like 70, or 10 pixels per inch, boy, in only 10 pixels per inch, you're definitely going to be able to see those individual pixels when you print something out, right? So let's take a look at this. Any individual image that you open, doesn't matter what image, you can go to image size, and we're strictly talking about print here. You can go in and choose this to inches, and you can see, okay, with my given pixel dimension, 5,500 by 3,697, without changing anything in this image, adding pixels or removing pixels, and without changing it, the contents of this image, I can print this at about 12 inches by 18 and a half inches or so, right? So that's what it would print. Now, when this resample checkbox is checked on and off, that means it's going to actually get rid of or add pixels. It's going to actually change this image. It's going to take 4 pixels and change them into 9, or it's going to take 9 pixels and change them into 1. If you downsample it or make it smaller, it's going to make changes to the actual pixels. It's going to get rid of information or remove information. If you don't have this checked, it's not going to change this number. It's not going to change how many pixels you can have. It's going to change how they're allocated in any given inch. So notice what happens if I say, all right, instead of 300 pixels per inch, I'm going to go down to half of that and do 150. It's actually going to double the size in inches at which I could print. Okay, so if I say I only need 150 pixels per inch, now notice each of these numbers doubles automatically, right? Because since I only have 150 instead of 300 pixels in an inch, I could print it bigger. It's just taking the given number of pixels and spreading them out on a sheet of paper, packing them in tighter, or spreading them out bigger, really. Okay? Not necessarily spreading them out because there's not gaps in between, but making them larger or smaller in any given inch. Okay? So let's say that, oh gosh, I needed a poster that was 40 inches. 40 inches. I can actually change this number and say, all right, it has to be 40 inches wide. Notice that at that point, it's going to automatically change this to 138. And maybe I'm not comfortable because you heard me say in the beginning, oh, you need 150 pixels per inch to really make it, not be able to see those individual pixels if you print it up. And so this at 138 pixels per inch, I might be able to start seeing some of that. And it really depends on the image, okay? But let's say that you want to have Photoshop. Okay, at this point, I might want to have it start creating some pixels for me because I need more pixels in there in order to get 150 at 40 inches wide. So at that point, I'll say, all right, let's go ahead and resample. Let's have Photoshop create more pixels. Now this number's going to start increasing. So Photoshop is going to actually create some pixels for me. So I'm going to say 150. And you notice now it went up from 5,000 to 6,000 pixels. So Photoshop's actually creating pixels for me. It's taking 1 pixel and changing those into 9 pixels or 16 pixels or however many it needs, right? So if I go even more, I say, you know what, I want professional quality. I want really high resolution. I want to go to 300, and now I've got like 12,000 pixels. Now it's really starting to increase the number of pixels. Now, you want to be careful as you start to resample, and resample is creating pixels. I've started with 5,000 and now I'm up to like 12,000. So the method which Photoshop goes about creating new pixels or removing pixels is called resampling. And Photoshop does a pretty good job of this. So, but there's, as a rule of thumb, I mean, I don't know, I probably wouldn't create more than, make it 30% bigger. At that point, things start to fall apart and have problems. Let me show you. Let me give you an example. So something that's easy to giving an example of. So I've got this picture of Mario here, and really this is only like 16 pixels by 16 pixels, I think. Image size, 16 pixels by 16 pixels. So it's just a tiny image, right? You saw when I opened it, it was, at 100%, this is what it looks like. Super tiny. I'm zoomed in right here, right? But let's look at it at 100%. Let's say, oh, I want to print this instead of at like really tiny 1 inch by 1 inch or half an inch by half an inch. I want to give it like, I don't know, let's print it by 8.5 by 11 or 8 inches by 8 inches or 10 inches by 10 inches. So I can come in here and say image size, and let's print this larger. So I'm going to go to inches here. And I'm also going to have Photoshop resample it. It's going to create more pixels for me. Right now I only got 16 pixels by 16 pixels, but I'm going to have, Tim said I need at least 150, and I want to print this by 1 inch. So I'm going to be creating pixels. It's going to be resampling. I'm going to say, let's go 8 inches by 8 inches, and I want it at least 150 pixels per inch. And you can already see what's kind of happening. It's blurring. It's making this blurry, right? So I had it create a bunch of pixels. There's a bunch of new pixels in here that Photoshop created, but in the end, it just kind of makes it a little bit blurry. It doesn't really look that good. Now, this is a drastic example of what's happening, but it's a similar example to what this is happening. If you really start to go crazy and have Photoshop do a bunch of resampling and add pixels that aren't there. It's not like CSI where you can take a picture of a car from a satellite and then res it up and blow up and get the license plate number. Just with this specific software, it just doesn't really work like that. So you got to be careful as to how much resing you want to go up and down. Now you also have to be careful if you go down, if you scale this down and then go back up, you're kind of getting rid of information when you go down. And then if you want to go back up, it's not really bringing it out of thin air. It's just trying to make it up. So watch what happens here. Image size, and I say, oh, I want to go to something really small. I'm gonna actually get a pixel dimension. Let's say we're gonna resample this, but we'll go down. I want only something that's like, I don't know, 100 pixels by 67 pixels. I've been asked to give somebody an icon that's that size. And I go down, and now if I look at this at 100%, that's what it looks like. Or if I zoom in, I've really gotten rid of a lot of pixels. That's what it looks like. And then I decide, you know what? I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna get a lot of larger pictures. Or maybe I downloaded an icon from the web and I'm like, oh, I want to print this a lot bigger, right? Similar thing, image size. I'm gonna go back in here and say, all right, I wanted to print this at 8 inches, so I'm gonna resample and have it create pixels 8 inches by 5 inches. I'll choose OK. Created a bunch of pixels for me, but it really doesn't look that good. It just kind of blurs it up. There's different ways. I'm going to go to File Revert and go back to my original image here. There's different ways that you can do it. If I go to Mario here and I go to Image, File Revert, and go back to my original 16 by 16 pixel image, there's different ways that I can do it. But if I were to go here to image size, and instead of 16 by 16 pixels, let's say resample, but let's not use automatic. Let's just try something like nearest neighbor, hard edges. Let's keep the hard edges. I could do that and say, all right, give me, instead of 16 pixels, let's go with 2000 pixels. I can choose OK. And now since I did it in different interpolation method, it kept those hard edges. But as I zoom in there, and if I were to look at view pixel grid here, show pixel grid, I can see, oh, it's created all these extra pixels in there, but it's retained the hard edges, right? So if I wanted to go with that style of interpolation, I could do that. You just have to be careful when you're when you're resampling. And the same thing happens, you may not even know it, but the same thing happens when you're using your crop tool. Because let's say that I go in here and I say, okay, I want a 1920 by 1080 pixel image at 300 pixels per inch. It's doing the same thing. It's resampling your image. It's getting rid of pixels or changing your pixels. So if I say, okay, I want to get 1920 by 1080 just in this little area, and I zoom into that really small area, and I say I want a 1920 by 1080 out of just this little eye here, and I double click on that, it's having to take the available pixels and create 1920 by 1080, and so it's blurring a little bit and things like that. And I could go back in even further, and I could, okay, I want to crop down into this little section here, and it's doing interpolation that way as well, even when you have your crop tool, just like when you have that checkbox checked, resample image, get rid of pixels or add pixels. Photoshop is making a decision on how many to create, what those colors are going to be when it creates them, or which pixels are going to be removed, and what are the remaining colors of the ones that it's going to have. So be careful when you do that, when you're using image size to scale your image. Boy, it's really having a long process here to do it. Now it's to figure that interpolation out, and again, getting a blurry image. I'm going to go back to File, Revert. So rule of thumb too, when you open up your image, if you go to image size, and you look at it without resampling it, and you say, okay, what's the largest I can print my image, probably without being able to see with the naked eye those pixels. If I go to 150, this image in particular, I could probably go with 36 by 24, so that would be the biggest I want to print it. And if I would go any bigger, I probably want to resample it, and probably don't want to go any, it could create any more than like 30% more pixels at most if I want to scale it up from there.